All right, what's up, everybody? As you can see, we're right around Christmas, so we're getting a little festive here. Pete Mandik is joining me today. Pete is a returning guest, but so some of you may already know who he is. But Pete, why don't you introduce yourself? Tell us who you are, what you do, all that stuff.
Hi, I'm Pete Mandik, returning guest. I'm a philosopher of mind. I'm also a cognitive scientist, and I write things about consciousness and representational content and brains. And I'm also a cartoonist.
Yeah, and they're really good cartoons. If you want, I could throw a link to some of the recent stuff you've been doing in the description of the video afterwards, and then people could go check it out.
Yeah, please do.
Okay, I will do that. And I know the last time we talked, we got all on this digression about science fiction, and I hope that happens because that was a lot of fun. You know, I don't plan out my conversations in advance, and I like to see where they go. But today there's a very rough plan, and the plan is to review a recent video from Emerson Green called "Mental Privacy: A Few Arguments in Favor." I skipped ahead of some of the early introductory remarks, but Emerson says that this is a sort of shortened version of a longer argument. So if I remember, I'll add a link to that longer argument so you can see more of the details there. I figured there was enough here, and you seemed to believe there was enough here for you to comment on. So I just wanted to look over this video because we are two people that are on the sort of receiving end of the sorts of critiques being presented here, the perspective being presented here. And Emerson is somebody that consistently produces very, very, like, I think very high quality content in terms of the audio quality. I really like how everything's structured and set up. Way better than my channel.
Yeah, he does good stuff.
Right. That is on the opposite end of things in terms of views about consciousness. And so I like to engage with that material. I think that's important and that's good. But I'm not a philosopher of mind. So I'm often struggling with, like, what was the thing that I read 15 years ago that I barely remember and don't really have a well-developed view about? But you, on the other hand, have a lot more specialized knowledge. So I thought it'd be cool to get your reaction to this.
I'm ready. I'm ready to react.
Cool. Okay, ready to react. Let's share the video. And there might be a few, well, whatever. We'll just get started on it. I don't need to have a long preamble. Oh, right. But before I do that, we'll get the video up. And we'll check the volume. Volume looks good.
Oh, yeah.
I'll just say hi to everybody in the chat. This has become a thing that I do. And I'll say that quick, and then we'll get started. Okay, so I don't remember when I started the video. So we'll say Sapir is... we'll just give it to people that are here first. Roberto that says hyped, you get 1,000 Lance loot. Sapir gets 500. And Illings gets 250. So y'all got...
oh, my God.
That's a lot of... Yeah, I have a lot of this currency that I'm giving out. And Pete, you get 10,000 for just showing up here. So I think you've outclassed everybody in the Lens loot. Yeah.
That's amazing.
You figure out what you could buy with it. It is... I don't know what the exchange rate is with Nathan Nichols, but you'll have to check with Nathan.
It just occurred to me that I actually have my own currency that I forgot about. In some of my comics, I have these like fake ads, like you would see in like old... like in the back of old comic books or on like Bazooka Joe comic wrappers. I have these like fake vintage ads. And the way you redeem these offers or purchase these weird items is through something I call thought tokens. And the way, so you collect thought tokens via some mysterious process. And then there's some other mysterious process whereby you spend the thought tokens. So in one of the comics, you have to, like, in order to cash in your thought tokens, you just like press your forehead against this dotted circle in the corner of the comic. So I'll figure out how to convert, what is it, Lance Loot and Nathan Nichols into thought tokens, the real currency.
That's the real currency?
Oh, yeah, it's completely secure. It's
okay.
It cannot be hacked, and it consumes no energy. I think it's going to take off.
Yeah, it might take off. I mean, there's a lot of these cryptocurrencies going around.
This is more crypto than cryptocurrency.
Yeah,
thought tokens.
All right. Okay. Let's get started on the video. And so the way this will work is I may have stuff to say, but I want you to let me know when you want me to pause. I don't know, like just say, hey, stop right here or whatever. I
Okay,
will
no
pause for you
problem.
to comment on it. All right.
Okay,
All right. Cool.
here we go.
Just being. I'm a subject of experience. If you were to squeeze my hand or stick a knife in it, it would feel like something for me when you did that. By contrast, if you stick a knife in the dirt beneath your feet, it's not like anything for the ground to have a knife stuck in it. Something I've
Can you
noticed about
stop
my
right
mind.
there?
I'm in.
Yeah.
I would say so far so good. Although it is a little weird for a panpsychist to say some of that stuff.
Why is that weird for a panpsychist to say that?
Well, normal people, if they wanted to try to explain what the heck consciousness is or consciousness related things are, they would draw a contrast between people who, if anyone has consciousness, it's probably people, and then somebody or something that doesn't have consciousness. So, for example, the ground. But if you're a panpsychist, like somehow everything has consciousness. So, in some sense, even the ground, the earth and the ground is something such that there's something it's like to be it. So I'm just noting with a little irony how tempting it is even for panpsychists to not talk like panpsychists.
All right. Fair enough.
I'm in a better position to know what's going on within my point of view than anybody else. I have privileged access. Pain, for example, is a mental event, and the subject is in a better place to know about that mental event than anybody else. They know about it with greater certainty than anybody else. As Colin McGinn put it, if consciousness is a stream, it is an invisible stream. Of course, I'm not just a mind, I'm also a physical body, which is closely conjoined with my mind. I'm an embodied conscious person. Thanks to the physical world, other minds, such as yourself, can have a pretty good idea of what's going on in my mind. Sometimes other people notice, attend to, physical indicators of my feelings and experiences before I attend to my feelings and experiences themselves, meaning they know what I'm feeling even before I'm fully aware that I'm having those feelings. Even so, they have to work from indicators of my feelings, not the feelings themselves. Certain physical behavior is reliably correlated with certain experiences, so this is actually pretty easy for an attentive observer. Now, even just in setting up
Okay,
what
so
we're
can you
going to be
pause it
talking
now?
about,
It might be worth it to the audience to belabor some of these points. So some of what I'm going to say right now, I'm sure I'm going to be repeating again later, but I think Emerson is doing a really good job right here and throughout the video, actually, of spelling out what is a pretty a standard way of thinking about the alleged privacy of the mental. And also, I think doing a fairly good job of spelling out what the like kind of common sense grounding of all this might be. So a lot of this stuff, I think, are a lot of just regular people who aren't fully immersed in the theory of all this stuff would agree to. Um, but I also want to signal, and I'm not intending this as a criticism of Emerson, but I do want to signal that he's mixing up or there's a lot of separable claims being made right here in this preamble. So like the basic idea that I might be in a better position to know something than someone else, that's fairly pedestrian point, and need not be controversial or even very philosophical. Um, but the idea that other people have indicators, but I have the feelings themselves. Now we've dipped into some very contentious territory, and there will be a lot of opportunities to ask what might that even mean to like have no indicators, just have the things themselves. So I just want to signal now that, as is often the case in philosophy, there are some things that are just kind of really quotidian or pedestrian sorts of points. Who could disagree with that? the idea that I know some stuff better than you do. But then there's this other stuff that borders on technicalia, things about like having indicators for something versus like just having the thing itself, sans any mediating indicators. Like that is a load of theory. Might be a good theory, might be a bad theory. It might be a theory that makes no sense at all, really. But I just want to signal that already there's a salad here of many sorts of ingredients. And I think we'll probably be able to tease that apart with a lot more care
Yeah,
a little bit later.
It's interesting that he points out this asymmetry where other people have to make inferences about your mental states on the basis of your sort of outward indicators, your behavior, whatever it is you're doing, facial expression, something like that. Someone like Nick Chater in The Mind is Flat would point out that there's a strong sense in which we do this about ourselves. If someone were to ask me about why I did something 5 minutes ago or a year ago or something like that, I may or may not be appealing directly to the experiences I was having at the time. I might instead recall what I did and theorize about what I did. And there is a certain sense in which we are ourselves observers of the indicators of our own behavior. And I can recall, and I think he may even, maybe Emerson would just agree with this. There may be points where you're doing something, and then you yourself didn't realize that you were doing something where you're like, oh, I guess I was angry and I didn't notice. I think he gives an example like that.
Yeah, well, and he concedes that right in this moment right before we paused it. Like, so he's aware of these sorts of objections. Mm-hmm. He's signaling ahead of time that he's aware of them. I think he's doing a great job. And like I said, I'm not waging any criticism right now, but I do want to telegraph that, one of the points I want to spend some time hammering on later is that there's actually a whole bunch of claims being presented here at once. And since you brought up asymmetry, maybe I'll just make a remark right now about asymmetry. Is that okay? Do you care? Can I just do whatever?
Go for it.
Whenever.
Do whatever you want.
So as Emerson will say a little bit later in the video, one way to think about all this privacy stuff is in terms of a kind of asymmetry, where the asymmetry is in this case between you, the haver of experiences, or the person who has the mental states in question, and everyone else. And more specifically, that asymmetry has to do with epistemic relations. And I think that's all absolutely correct. I just want to spend a little time really spelling that out. But one thing I want to start by saying is that privacy is a word we use in a lot of different contexts, and there's a lot of different kinds of privacy besides the sorts of privacy that philosophers of mind are interested in. Nonetheless, I think one can make the case that there's a common core to all privacy notions, and they all can be spelled out in terms of a kind of asymmetry between the group as a whole, for whatever group you're interested in, like all humans or all members of an economic system, anyone who wears clothing, if we're talking about private parts versus private property. So there's some group considered as a whole, and then there's some proper subgroup, maybe just a single person or a small group of people. And then there's some thing, which is the thing we're calling private. And what it means to call that thing private is to say that there's some asymmetry with respect to the relations that the subgroup can bear to that thing versus the group as a whole. So when it comes to like private property, my wife and I might share ownership of a car. That's our private property. And so there's an asymmetry in the certain kinds of relations that my wife and I bear to that car relative to the group as a whole. It's not public property. Lance, you just can't come over and drive my car whenever you want. So there's an asymmetry with respect to things like, who gets to drive the car and when, and who's responsible for paying for it. And so we could define private property in contrast to public property. And so there's this opposition between private and public that all comes down to asymmetry versus symmetry of some set of relations. We could do the same thing with private parts. There's certain parts of my body that I could look at whenever I want, but no one else can. Those are the private parts. Other things are public. And so what we're interested in here, and by here I mean philosophy of mind, is some kind of general asymmetry with respect to epistemic relations, where epistemic relations include things like knowing. So I know that blah, blah, blah. It could be maybe knowing with certainty. It might be some milder epistemic relation, like having justification for believing. That might be something that falls short of knowledge, let alone knowledge with certainty, but it's still arguably an epistemic relation. So part of the reason why I want to belabor this point about how to think about privacy in general and how to define privacy in general is to highlight the very real possibility that there's a whole bunch of privacy claims that one might make and one might evaluate. So, and a lot of this Emerson himself gets into, right? So are we talking about knowledge versus knowledge with certainty? Are we talking about knowledge at all versus like having justification or having evidence? But nonetheless, like there's separate privacy claims one might make depending on what particular epistemic relation you're interested in. Also, another way you can multiply privacy claims is with respect to the modal force of these claims. Are you saying that it's like logically necessary that only I can have justification or evidence regarding my own mental states? Or are you just saying it's like it's really difficult but not absolutely impossible? So we could come up with a set of possible privacy claims that all hinge on a particular epistemic relation, but vary with respect to their modal force. And I think a good reason for being this pedantic and nitpicky is to raise worries later about whether maybe there's some equivocation, maybe there's some Mott and Bailey, because there are certain asymmetry claims you might want to make about epistemic access that even a so-called opponent of privacy, such as myself, would be perfectly happy granting. That if instead of talking about like something being really, 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 really difficult, it was absolutely impossible, right? If it's just really, really difficult, like, yeah, sure, I could concede that it's really difficult for someone who isn't me to have evidence that my ankle hurts. But that might just be like it's really easy for people that are currently in West Orange, New Jersey, to know stuff about West Orange, New Jersey. People that are in Australia right now, it's going to be a little bit harder for them to know like what the local weather is. Like I could just like look out my window right now. They would have to access an app or maybe fly all the way around the world. So I just want to highlight that, and I suspect it's going to keep coming up. Like, what are you so here's my impersonation of a really bad defender of privacy, which of course I'm not accusing Emerson of, but we can imagine someone doing a really terrible job and saying like, oh, are you saying, Lance and Pete, that there's absolutely no asymmetry with epistemic relations to one's own mental states? Is that what you're saying? Well, that of course would be an absurd thing to deny, right? So therefore you must grant that there's some privacy, right? But then now you got to watch out for the slippery slope to super duper privacy, really real ultra privacy, where it's like metaphysically impossible for anyone to have this evidence that each of us has about our own mental states. So I just wanted to signal that danger of that there being some kind of Mott and Bailey fallacy being committed or some kind of argument by equivocation. We must watch out for that. One more thing I want to signal. Sorry about all this signaling, but I'm a professor, and so I have a tendency to be pedantic. One sort of issue that comes up in philosophy of mind, especially when philosophy of mind is focusing on consciousness, is the issue of whether we are sliding from epistemic issues to metaphysical issues. So, as Emerson, I think, correctly points out, first and foremost, what philosophers are interested in when they talk about the privacy of the mental is a host of claims about epistemic relations, claims about what you can know or what you could have justified belief in or what you could be certain about. But often people want to argue in philosophy of mind for certain metaphysical positions based on certain epistemic premises. So famously, there's the knowledge argument. Mary and her black and white room, that's an argument where we're starting with claims about knowing and whether you can know what it's like, blah, 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 and then trying to draw conclusions that are metaphysical, that are the conclusions about the falsity of physicalism. Dave Chalmers points out, I think, brilliantly, that we could see all the major arguments against physicalism that have dominated the literature as having this general form of arguing from the epistemic to the metaphysical. So in this 2003 paper of Chalmers, Consciousness and Its Place in the Natural World, he reconstructs the conceivability arguments about zombies and the explanatory gap arguments and the knowledge argument with Black and White Mary as all having this common form of there being these epistemic premises and then this metaphysical conclusion. And one of the things I hope we have, if I ever shut up and let us watch the rest of the video, I want to raise some worries about whether Emerson himself is making that sort of move. Because we're first and foremost starting with some claims about what's going on with the epistemology of mental states. But is there going to be some kind of move to a metaphysical claim? And is that move going to be a sneaky slide or a completely virtuous, impeccable argument? We shall see.
All right.
Let's watch some more video.
Let's do it.
I've already said a couple things that might bother physicalists, the philosophers who think consciousness is nothing over and above the physical material of the brain. But there are many strains of physicalism, and some of the stranger forms would disagree with the less contentious things I said, like that I have privileged access to my own mind, that I'm in a better place to know about my experiences than anyone else. Qualitative or phenomenal properties are typically understood as private, meaning they are not publicly observable like ordinary physical properties. Some physicalists think phenomenal consciousness is an illusion, and privacy is one of those illusory aspects of the mind that they think we should reject. For example, in Quining Qualia, Daniel Dennett identifies privacy as one of the attributes of this illusory phenomenal consciousness. Today, we won't be focusing on the negative case against privacy, but rather on building a positive case for it. So I won't be examining in detail the negative arguments against privacy, privileged access, invisibility, etc., at least not today. Illusionists and other privacy skeptics have rejected this aspect of the mind, so in defending privacy, I'm arguing against illusionism. The fact that something about consciousness is private is not a philosopher's fiction or some technical bit of jargon that doesn't have any relevance outside philosophy of mind. Privacy creeps into other areas of philosophy, as well as science, medicine, and ordinary life. And that's mainly what the last section is about. Even if you think eliminating privacy is a live option, it's not an option to remove it with surgical precision, avoiding any further repercussions.
I just want to say, Emerson, I love that part. That was a cool line about, I mean, I don't agree with it, but it was a really nice way of putting the point. I like that stuff about how it can't be removed with surgical precision.
All right.
So
Yeah.
he's a cool guy. I haven't spoken to him directly, but we interact sometimes on Twitter, and I watch some of his videos. I like how he does this stuff, even though I disagree. But I just thought that was a really cool part of the video, and a really nice way of making the claim that he wants to make, which is that maybe some things that come up in philosophy mind are just things that philosophers have made up, and we could delete them and reset without much loss for our everyday lives. But this, he is claiming, if you're going to remove this, it's going to be a major surgery. You're not going to be able to just lance the boil, pun intended, Lance. It's not just going to be a quick outpatient surgery. It's going to be a major procedure that will leave you scarred for life. So don't mess with privacy. So kudos to Emerson. But we shall see, what parts we could take out and how surgical we could be. I suspect like in the game of Operation, the nose won't light up. We'll get the breadbasket out for 20 Lance Lutz and save the patient.
Yeah. I mean, I like this notion of surgical precision. I guess, if I'm going to push the metaphor really hard, I would just say that I think that proponents of illusionism adjacent views can and are in the process of developing better and better surgical instruments. And, there may have been a point in time where we would say that we don't have the tools to do it, but I think that's a point we've either already arrived at, or I have every confidence we will arrive at some point. I don't feel like science has settled all of what you might call the easy problems of consciousness. I think I would call them the only problems of consciousness. But it's a direction that we're moving in. Dan Dennett would make these comparisons to life, and how there was a point in time where people might have said, there's this protoplasm or a lane vital. There's something special about life that it is essentially different from non-living things. And with more and more discoveries in chemistry and I guess probably a variety of adjacent fields, that sense dissolved. And I do wonder whether that can or will dissolve when it comes to this sense that consciousness is just impenetrable to the sciences. So I guess I'll ask you what you think. Do you think that this like sense people have, that there's just some gap between our explanations and their intuitions, or whatever, however you want to frame it? Do you think that that's something that we will eventually overcome or surpass, and that sense will dissolve, or will it persist even if we have satisfactory accounts of consciousness that don't call for qualia?
I think it'll persist. And, if you look at other things, like, is the world round? Or is Jesus Christ your Lord and Savior? There's some people that get over it and some people that never get over it. And there's always revivals. There's always pockets of people that believe whatever, you name it. There's probably some alchemists out there. So, with respect to your example about Elan Vital and vitalism, one might argue that the vitalists are having a resurgence. They don't call what makes life special in Elan Vital, but there are a lot of people, working scientists now, that are saying that we need to radically rethink how we conceive of life and its relation to other aspects of the natural order, its relation to chemistry and physics. And so nothing ever dies. There's never total victory. You never totally dispatch ideas. And another point I want to squeeze in here, and also there's another opportunity to praise Emerson before we go after him mercilessly. Emerson is doing a nice job of highlighting some of the reasons why this stuff is important. A lot of contemporary discussion of consciousness in philosophy and in the sciences of consciousness interacts with some topics that are quite important. Like, for example, what non-humans non-human animals, like what sort of moral status they have, what did they, you know, which of them should we regard as having moral patienthood? Which of them have rights, like a right to life or rights to autonomy? A lot of that is tied up in a lot of contemporary discourse in connection with sentience. Sentience is a word that gets used a lot by people that are trying to make a case for animals. And that's just a hop in sentience is just like a hop and a skip away from phenomenal consciousness, and if not just identical to it. So a lot of these issues are really quite literally issues of life and death. One of the things that Emerson mentions a little bit later on in the video is how until recently there were surgeries being performed on unanesthetized newborns, which is startling. At least to me, I've spent a lot of time around newborns, and because I have 4 kids, I feel like I've got a good grasp of when they're in pain and when they're not in pain. And to me, it just seems like a no-brainer that you wouldn't perform a major surgery on an unanesthetized newborn. But as Emerson points out, that was actually controversial, and there's a lot of people that didn't see what the problem might be. And that's important. That seems like something really important to not get wrong. And it also seems like it's quite relevant to these sometimes very abstract conversations about consciousness. It's not just all thought experiments about Mary and zombies. Some of it is just really gets into some very real world nuts and bolts stuff about, like, well, what is the right way to perform surgery on somebody? What sorts of condition does that person have to be in, and how do you know if you're doing it the right way or not, where right means something of some kind of moral import? And so yeah, this is, I think good on him to tie it to these sorts of issues. And I think one of his most compelling arguments, which ultimately I'm not convinced by, but one of his most compelling arguments has to do with these sorts of real world asymmetries that would pop up and manifest in like disagreements about, like, well, is this non-human animal capable of suffering? Is this very young human capable of suffering? And people could disagree about that in ways that arguably gives a bit of support to the privacy claims.
All right. Should we keep going?
Let's do it.
All right.
So I'm going to provide a few lengthy passages from philosophers who have all different kinds of views on privacy, just to ensure that everyone is on the same page. And if you listened to my epistemology series from a while back, you'll know that I think understanding a word is not usually a matter of knowing a definition. I think definitions are overrated and unnecessary in understanding a concept. It's better to give examples if you want someone to understand a term. Giving
I just want to pause there to say I aggressively agree with that remark. It's one of the more frustrating things that can happen, especially like in intro courses or talking to people online, where they'll say, what is your definition of some term, or what is the definition of some term, as if that's supposed to settle the matter. And I also get frustrated when students or just people I'm arguing with quote a dictionary for some term in a philosophical exchange, as if that's going to settle the matter. Whatever dictionary definition you happen to stumble across first, that just is what we're going to work with. Like they just treat them as these like definitive, prescriptive, complete, and thorough, accounts of something like morality or God or consciousness. And I don't know why people think definitions, or especially like pulling a definition out of a dictionary, can settle the matter. That's going to fix the term for the purposes of
right. Yeah, I think definitions have a place, and there's probably a lot of agreement between the two of us about this topic, but also between us and Emerson. I do agree with Emerson's statement that oftentimes you don't there's no point in giving a definition. It's better to give examples. I would, however, say some things in favor of definitions and also in favor of dictionaries. If you are trying to make a deductive argument, if the conclusion of your argument is supposed to follow deductively from your premises, then you almost certainly are going to need some kind of definition. Otherwise, how and why would it follow? Why would it? Why would being able to conceive of zombies, for example, have anything at all to do with whether physicalism is true, or whether consciousness can't be physicalized? You need to spell that out. Otherwise, like, there's just no entailment relations there. You would have to, so here's an example. Can something be red and green all over at the same time? Now, some people think that the answer to that is obviously no, but obviously no is not an argument. It's not a deductive argument. If you were wanting to give me a deductive argument that something couldn't be red and green all over, you would have to spell out what green is and what red is, such that there would be some kind of like logical structure to claims about green and claims about red. And then we could apply the laws of logic to those claims and then derive logically that a thing cannot be both red and green all over. But if you don't say anything at all about red and green, there's just this undefined predicate, red, and this other undefined predicate, green. And for all you've said, maybe red and green is just the same property. Like, a lot of things that are obvious are not something you could plug into an argument. You need to unpack it and you need to supply some definitions. So depending on what one's dialectical purpose is, maybe we do need to give some definitions. Although, if instead of trying to construct deductive arguments, we're interested in doing something else, like just trying to get out the door, or get the kids to school, or do some science, maybe definitions can really slow us down. I had a really interesting experience once at a interdisciplinary conference in Vancouver, where there were a bunch of neuroscientists and a bunch of psychologists and a bunch of philosophers. And the conference was about color in a broad sense. So some of it was about color vision. Some of it was about color memory. There's some stuff about like blind sight, some stuff about just plain old philosophy, metaphysics of color and subjectivism versus objectivism. But anyway, there's this one point in the conference during some Q&A session where scientists stood up during a philosopher's talk. I mean, it was during the Q&A. He wasn't interrupting the talk, but he made this general statement about concepts I thought was quite nice. And he said, you philosophers, you want clear, crisp concepts. And that's all well and good for certain situations. But in science, a lot of times that could really hold you back. That you need, in order to do lots and lots of parts of science, you need the concept to be kind of fuzzy, to be kind of open. If you just decide ahead of time that it's going to have this, and this definition, then you close yourself off to all sorts of hypotheses and all sorts of experimental tests. And maybe you're closing yourself off to the growth of empirical knowledge. And so, if you want to do science, a lot of times you just need to allow yourself to have like some examples. Like, so what's color vision? It's like when your eyes are open and you can tell when something's periwinkle. That's not a definition. It's just an example. And we take it from there. And if we run into some problems, like maybe this group of scientists and this other group of scientists disagree in the interpretation of some experiment, then you could hash it out and cook up some different definitions and see which definitions maybe both groups can agree to. So I guess part of what I want to say is that definitions have a place, And perhaps appropriately, you cannot define ahead of time what place definitions have. We kind of are just winging it and being kind of loose. And with respect to dictionaries, I think dictionaries are really useful if we treat them as what they are, which is a body of very rough empirical hypotheses about how people use words. And the way people use words involves lots and lots of people whose uses in individual situations maybe don't perfectly reflect other individual situations. These are just rough generalizations about a whole lot of people and a whole lot of uses. And further, a lot of this stuff changes over time. Nonetheless, I wish more people read the dictionary more often, because I will run into people saying, for example, that this judgment has nothing to do with appearances or seeming. That's all just a matter of qualia. Well, that's interesting, because it seems to me people talk about appearance in connection with judgment so often that it's made its way into standard English dictionaries. So do I win the argument about like the metaphysics of appearance? No, but I do win the argument about whether it's weird to make that hypothesis. It can't be weird if it's still in the dictionary, can it? So I do wish philosophers in particular would read the dictionary more often. One of the things I miss about so-called ordinary language philosophy is that there was a lot of respect for things like dictionaries and people that pay attention to the way words get used, and to try to avoid getting completely out of control with made up phrases and locutions. So anyway, I ultimately agree with both of you guys, but I do want to say, read a dictionary, people. Please, once in a while, look in the dictionary. And also, it is good to pause and give a definition. But there's a time and a place.
Yeah, so I have a few things to say about this. I don't even know how much of this video we'll get into, but if we have stuff to say, let's say it.
We're almost 5 minutes into the video.
And I skipped a couple minutes of it to get us there. Yeah. So with respect to like ordinary language philosophy, I wasn't around for its heyday, and I don't know how much I would agree with ordinary language philosophers when they were like sort of, I don't know, in their prime. But insofar as I am critical of appeals to dictionaries and definitions, it's not in any of the senses you've outlined. Those are all the sort of virtuous uses of it. And it's the same thing with like logic. Like, I've been critical of what the capabilities of deductive logic are recently on my blog, and other people have been talking about this. On my blog and then on Facebook and some discussions elsewhere. That does not mean I'm anti-logic. I think that logic serves particular dialectical purposes, and that people sometimes inappropriately extend its uses outside of what the appropriate dialectical purposes are. And the same thing applies to appealing to dictionaries, or appealing to what words mean, or offering a definition for in some discussion. With deduction, yeah, you have to be clear about what you mean, and if you have to stipulate a definition, fine. And so I certainly think that philosophers should be more attentive to dictionaries. But in another sense, I would say that I don't think that they go far enough. Being attentive to dictionaries is not enough. I think that philosophers should also strive to remain grounded, not just in what they would read in a book, but in face-to-face interactions with human beings that are not philosophers, and where they got to try to turn off most of their philosopher hat. Like, they got to take off the philosopher hat and just absorb the sort of gestalt of how people think and speak and act in everyday circumstances. Because a lot of times the examples philosophers give of, supposed snippets of ordinary language or thought are so contrived and artificial that I wonder why. Like, and this is such a problem that these formalistic ways of phrasing even worm their way into empirical research in moral psychology, where you'll see studies where they'll ask participants in a study, do you think a person would be morally culpable if they, who cares? At that point already, no one goes around saying, oh, that person's morally culpable. That's just not a word people typically use. That's a word someone would go, ooh, I'm studying for the GRE. I better know this word. Kind of like words I see all the time, and when people want to sound fancy, like a juxtapose. No one says that, and yet this pops up in
I
research.
juxtapose things every day, Lance. Always juxtapose.
People don't talk like that, and I don't just mean the individual words. I mean the whole structure and phrasing of questions in psychological research often have this artificiality, and so do a lot of philosophers' constructions. They'll say stuff like, "Would it be morally permissible to torture a baby just for fun?" And that people that don't have training in philosophy often balk or scoff at that last part, like just for fun. Like, oh, you're trying to imply something about the person that they would torture for fun. There's a reason why philosophers would include that, and that it's to forestall the kinds of goofy things people will do, where they'll say, well, maybe there's a good reason to torture a baby under some circumstances. What if space pirates show up and they say, we're going to torture all the babies in the galaxy if you don't torture this one baby here? So then you'd have a good reason to torture the baby to prevent an even greater number of baby tortures. And so when you say just for fun, it's to forestall that kind of confusion. But non-philosophers don't see it that way. So there's often a disconnect. And I think it's important to remain grounded. And insofar as, for philosophers, insofar as dictionaries help us remain grounded, so too do I think interaction with ordinary people. By ordinary people, I mean people that haven't studied too much philosophy, where their brains are up in the clouds. And that's one thing that I agree with you about what Emerson is doing here, is there seems to be a conscious effort to keep what are often conveyed as highly abstract issues grounded in the practicality of everyday life. And that is a very important thing for good philosophy to do. And it comes right at the outset of the video. So you're not wondering, halfway through the video, who cares? What the hell is the point of all this? No, this is immediately relevant and remains relevant. So yeah, it's a really good thing. I'll mention one last thing, which is that definitions absolutely constrain issues. And I give an example of this in my courses on moral psychology. So there is this popular paradigm, the moral conventional distinction. And the researchers that proposed this paradigm basically just started with this top-down presumption. Morality is about harm, justice, and rights. It has these particular metanormative characteristics. And then they devised a set of stimuli that presupposed those particular characteristics and then presented that to participants. On the one hand, that gives them this really neat criteria for distinguishing whether a person is judging an issue to be a quote unquote moral issue versus a non-moral issue. But when you rigidify your operational definition for empirical purposes, you could leave out whether that same pattern would emerge for things outside the scope of what you've sort of like predefined in advance is the definition you're going with. So operational definitions, they do appear in the sciences, but they can sometimes lead to unnecessary strictures in how a person is constructing the stimuli for their studies. And then the result is that data that tends to mirror the presumptive structure of the questions. So what I mean by this is I pick a very narrow set of issues that I'd say these are the moral issues. And then I pick a whole bunch of other issues that in Turiel's case and other people that did this research are social conventions, like wearing pajamas to class. A lot of these were devised for children because they wanted to see the early emergence of this. So a lot of them were like schoolyard things like pulling hair and speaking during class. Anyway, so many children, at least in Western societies, distinguish the moral judgments from the non-moral judgments. But the issue is that, if you look at the whole like possibility space of norms you could have asked them about, if you narrowly select ones where you're very confident they'll distinguish those from the social conventions and say these are the moral ones, people might do that, even if there might be this broad range of intermediary norms that would just blur the distinction or collapse the distinction. And so, it's very simple to say, hey, A is distinguished from B by this set of characteristics, and then you pick exemplars that happen to have those characteristics, and you don't pick other members of the category of A that actually blur or collapse the distinction with B. So that can be a real problem with like these stipulative definitions in the sciences. They could overlook issues. Is that the kind of thing you're thinking of?
Yes.
Okay.
But I mostly was trying to think of something by deference to this guy who spoke in Vancouver in 2011. So whatever he meant is what I was trying to wave my hands at.
Okay. I was just trying to give an example from my like research I'm familiar with.
Yeah. yeah, I wish I could come up with an example off the top of my head, but yes, when doing when trying to do some kind of scientific investigation, you want to be sort of open. Here's a fictional example. Suppose it was decided early on that by definition whales were fish. That that so what sorts of what sorts of experiments then or investigations would you close yourself off to if everyone just stuck to their guns and said, like, look, when we first saw those things, we called them fish, and so gosh darn it, they're still fish, and so we have to rejigger the whole rest of our biological taxonomies so we can make sure that whales turn out to be fish. And then when it's later discovered that they have lungs and all these other fish don't have lungs, and they're warm blooded and all these other fish aren't warm blooded, what do we get? What are we going to do? It, there's you might say, like, well, we have to since by definition they're fish, we need to figure out how they're actually really cold-blooded after all, and figure out the special circumstances whereby they seem like they're warm-blooded. Like a lot of strange things would have unfolded in the sciences if we stuck to our guns about this so-called definition. You kind of blind yourself if you think things have to be this one way versus this other way. But if you just kind of leave it open, like, yeah, I mean, like, roughly what we mean is, like, those things roughly, but like you used to say, like you were saying whales were fish and they're not like those other things. Oh, well, I guess we were wrong. They were not fish after all. We reserve the right to just change our definition as we go. So if you're open like that with respect to definitions, then you're open to, revising things on the fly instead of getting stuck in a groove. So I don't think I'm doing a great job of giving a killer example of this sort of thing. But
that is an opportunity for a killer whale pun, though.
Oh my gosh. I'm sad I overlooked that possibility.
All right. Should we just continue with the video? I feel like we're just
maybe even speed it up, because at this rate we're doing we're speaking for 10 minutes for every 1 minute of Emerson's video, and
it's a lot of content for the channel. And I did just hit 100,000 views, so maybe this is working. I don't know.
All right.
All right, let's keep going. But again, I don't feel reluctant to pause if you have something to say, though. I mean, if we get through 6 minutes of the video, that's fine. If we have good stuff to say, we got good stuff to say. It's really not about the video. It's using the video as a springboard for conversation. Anyway.
Yeah. So what he's going to do next is quote this Mandik guy, and he's going to comment on the Mandik quote and then move on to someone who he likes better than me, Hedda Hassel-Morch, and quote her. So maybe we could go through that at double speed or 1.5 speed or something, because who cares what Mandik says?
1.25. So let's see how that goes.
Pump it up. Oh yeah. All right, put on your seatbelts, everybody.
A definition is usually not the shortest pathway there. So I'm relying on these lengthy passages so you can see how the concept is used and how it fits into the broader conceptual web. So here's Qualia Quietus Pete Mandik setting up a view that he does not agree with. Quote, one of the central ideas that behaviorists rebel against, an idea with close associations with Descartes and his dualism, is the idea of the privacy of the mental. The idea of privacy is that you can only have knowledge of your own mind. You can make an educated guess about other minds, but you can only know, or only know with certainty, your own mind. From a Cartesian point of view, sensations are known only privately. Others can observe your behaviors, but only you can experience your sensations. From the point of view of someone on the outside, your sensations might be very different or altogether missing. So I would disagree with that bit about knowledge. I don't think privacy implies that you can only have knowledge of your own mind. If it did, that would that would almost be a sufficient argument against privacy. If you could not know that other minds exist, if you accept the privacy thesis, that would be a sufficient reason to reject privacy. So you can know about other minds, but the point about certainty is a fairly common one. If anything is certain, the existence of my own mind is certain. Not so with other minds. I can easily doubt the existence of other minds, since there's some kind of epistemic asymmetry between the mental states of others and my own mental states.
So can you
best
pause for a
explained by
second?
privacy.
Yep.
Right. So Emerson is being very virtuous here.
So-
Again, not criticizing him, but I do want to flag that, if one were to try to give a brief account of what privacy is supposed to be, you might try to put it in kind of ordinary way, like that Mandik guy just did. I don't know what he's quoting from, but I'm going to guess that's from my book, This is Philosophy of Mind. I don't know. I endorse the quote. It seems like a good quote. So it seems like something I would have said. But if you were like just trying to briefly explain to somebody like what privacy is supposed to be, you might use a regular word or phrase like not know. Like you can only know about your own mental states, but other people can't. But Emerson correctly perceives that claim right there, while easy to express, is also easy to argue against. Right. So he's already preemptively trying to protect privacy against counter argument by pivoting to this more rarefied epistemic relation, knowledge with certainty. Knowledge with certainty can only arise with respect to a mental state and the haver of that mental state. But anybody else on the outside, so to speak, can never know with certainty. So there's again, he's not yet giving an argument from equivocation or committing a Mott and Bailey fallacy, but there's already awareness of the dialectic and what the arguments against privacy are going to be in an attempt to preempt them. And we'll see some later preemptings too. But yeah, right. If the claim is one about knowledge, that's really difficult to defend. We're, unless you are attracted to super skepticism, a lot of us are fairly happy with some fairly loose criteria of knowledge, whereby like I can know stuff based on testimony. I trust you, Lance. I don't know exactly why I trust you, but if you told me that you had a pound and a half of pork ribs in your kitchen right now, I would believe you. I might even say I know that. If someone asked me, does Lance Bush have any food in his house? I would say, yeah, I know that he has at least a pound and a half of pork ribs based on that testimony. So if you're going to be open about knowledge descriptions like that, then it doesn't seem like there would be an asymmetry with respect to a person in their own mental states versus everybody else. Right. So just wanted to flag what I was saying earlier, that there's multiple privacy claims at stake. And if one doesn't want to get accused of some tomfoolery, you got to make sure which claim you're really defending. Is it a modally strong claim, or is it something that's kind of modally weak?
Yeah, incidentally, his latest video is on testimony and its status as a form of evidence. So probably also something worth having a look at. All right, let's keep going.
All right, let's continue on to the Morch.
Existence of other minds, since there's some kind of epistemic asymmetry between the mental states of others and my own mental states, a fact that is best explained by privacy. So Hedda Hasselmerk explains
pause.
Further, quote,
pause. One of my favorite points that I want to make in reaction to this whole video is about explanation. So we're gonna, if we actually watch the whole video, we're gonna hear Emerson say several times that he's making an argument based on explanation, that he is arguing for privacy as an explanation of something else, which in lots of areas of life is, I think, a perfectly fine way of arguing. I believe that my wife is downstairs right now because that would explain certain noises I'm hearing from up here in the attic. Um, lots of a lot of scientific inference proceeds in a similar sort of way. We believe, those of us who do believe in the atomic theory of matter, because if that were true, the atomic theory of matter, that would explain a bunch of observable results about what happens to chemical substances under various pressures and temperatures and in various combinations. And so it's pretty common to argue that way. Some people even make it sound fancy and call it like inference to the best explanation. So when there's an explanation, sometimes we also have an argument. You're arguing for something because if that something were true, that would explain this other thing that you're just accepting as already being true. So, you know, why does my car keep veering to the left? Well, here's something that would explain that. The air is low in one of the tires. That would explain why the car is pulling to the left. Perfectly fine. It's not deductively perfect. That's not an absolute proof, but it's pretty good reasoning. I'll allow it in all sorts of areas in life, and I'll even allow it in the philosophy of mind. So I just want to flag that. And I'll also, here's a spoiler. One of the complaints I'm going to make is whether that's actually a good explanation. One of the things that we would like from explanations is that they're not circular. So one famous sort of example of bad circular explanations is one that comes from this Moliere play, and there's this character referred to as the Good Doctor. And in a comedic moment during the play, the Good Doctor explains why opium makes you sleepy, because somebody asked him that, like, why does opium make you sleepy? And this is a famous example in like introductory classes in the philosophy of science, this Moliere example. And the Good Doctor says opium makes you sleepy because it has a virtus dormitive, which sounds really cool. Like, oh, wow, virtus dormitive. It's the thing that explains opium making you sleepy. Wow, I didn't know opium had virtus dormitive in it, but yeah, I guess that would explain it. But here's the joke. Virtus dormitive is just Latin for sleep-causing power. It has the sleep-causing virtue, virtus dormitive. And so it's not really an explanation. It's just a tautology. But like the one half of the tautology is in English and the other half is in Latin. So if I told you dogs are dogs, or the sky is blue because the sky is blue, I'm just repeating myself and sticking an is or a because in the middle of it. Yeah, the sky is blue. If and only if the sky is blue, who could deny that? Dogs are indeed dogs. That's kind of a no-brainer, of course. Virtus dormitive explanations is a phrase that people in philosophy of science use to complain about circular explanations. So if something on the face of it looks like an explanation, but if you just dig deep, it turns that they're really just saying a tautology, and they've dressed up one part of the tautology in slightly different wording, then it's not really an explanation. You might as well have said, the reason why this happens is just because. It happens because it happens. That's not an explanation. And so one of the issues that I hope to raise again and again in our conversation today is Emerson giving us a virtus dormitive explanation? So if it's a virtuous non-circular explanation, then there's some pattern of data that we want to explain, and privacy is somehow something else. And so we're citing privacy to explain the data. Just like my car veering to the left is one thing, and then there's this something else, which is the tire is low on air. I've got 4 tires, only one of them is low on air. It happens to be on the left side of the vehicle, and that's why it's veering to the left. That's a non-circular explanation. It might turn out to be a false explanation. It might turn out upon investigation that the tires are equally filled up to the required air pressure. But it's not a circular explanation. Veering to the left and having such and such tire filled up to such and such pressure are just 2 separate situations. You could have the one without the other. It's not just a code word for veering to the left. But privacy is supposed to be the explanation of something else. So what's the something else? If the something else is that there's this asymmetry, and then privacy is that there's this asymmetry, then that's a Virtus Normative explanation. You've just renamed the phenomenon, not explained it. So we shall see. We shall see.
All right, let's see.
To say that one's conscious states are private does not mean that nobody else can know anything about them. It rather means that nobody else can know about them in the same direct way. That is, my own conscious states appear directly to me, whereas the conscious states of other people we infer or perceive indirectly through their behavior, verbal reports, facial expressions, and so on. Because
Can
of
you
this
pause it?
direct access, many philosophers also use.
I'm sorry to the audience for being such a pain in the ass, but I'm not going to stop. So one thing I want to point out is the stuff about directness versus indirectness. This is a huge player. This concept that that some things are direct and some things are indirect. That concept is a huge player in the philosophy of mind. So a lot of discussions of qualia have to do with their allegedly being something that could be directly known. Some of the discourse about qualia is about certain semantic relations, whether there's like direct reference as opposed to reference by description. So directness is something that shows up quite a bit, and I think it's fair to wonder whether directness is some like technical concept. Another thing to wonder is like whether technical or not, whether it's just a confused concept. And one thing that's might be worth saying about things like concepts like direct, or a contrast between direct versus indirect, is in a non-technical, non-philosophy context, you would spell the distinction out in terms of certain analogies. And in those analogies, the directness versus indirectness is relative in the following sense. Some things are relatively more direct than others. In these examples, and I'll run through an example, I just want to highlight that in the example, it's not absolutely direct. It's just more direct than the other thing in the example. Just like I'm not absolutely tall. Lance, by the way, how tall are you?
About 6'1".
You're 6'1". So you're taller than me, because I'm 6'0". So you're taller than me. But it wouldn't be meaningful to say that you're absolutely tall. What, like you what does that mean? You just are identical to the property of tallness, or you're the tallest thing in the universe, or the tallest thing conceivable? Like we all understand that tallness is relative. I might literally utter Lance is tall, and in certain contexts be perfectly well understood what I mean. People would understand what I mean by that, but no one would think I'm committing to you having this like monadic, non-relational tallness. They could, even though they're not philosophers, they could work through some kind of reconstruction whereby, relative to some understood class that defines the context, you're taller than them. but you're not absolutely tall. You're just relatively tall. Relative to Mandik, you're tall. So with respect to directness and indirectness, one sort of example that kind of illustrates the distinction is the difference between looking at an object that is right in front of your face versus looking at something that is on a computer monitor. So I can see my thermos directly, but Lance can only see the thermos indirectly. What he's seeing more directly than the thermos is this image on his screen. Presumably, you're not just nodding in front of a blank screen. You can actually see it. Okay, you're not just pretending. So he can see my thermos. He could see perhaps that there's a Boltzmann brain sticker designed by Pete Mandik. Redeem your thought tokens. You could have a sticker. So you see it indirectly. And we might say that like what you see more directly than the thermos is the image on your screen. We might also tell a further story and say that you are doing some thinking or reasoning. You have to think on some level. You have to think like, oh, what would make this image appear on my screen? Oh, I know. I'm running Zoom or something like that. I'm in a meeting. There's some kind of causal connection, right? A lot of us just take for granted that that's how telecommunication works. But we think about it a little bit, we realize like, yeah, right. There's literally a whole lot happening in between Lance and my thermos that isn't happening in between Pete Mandik and Pete Mandik's thermos. So I am relatively more directly related. And we can, by analogy, theorize about how visual perception works in an individual. So instead of comparing me to Lance, where are you? You're in Virginia. I'm in New Jersey.
I'm in New York.
An undisclosed location in New York.
Undisclosed, yeah.
So it's undisclosed New York. So instead of contrast between New Jersey, a person in New Jersey and a person in New York, just think about a contrast between what's outside of my body and what's inside of me. So I see this thermos by courtesy of a whole bunch of processes that are in between the thermos and in some sense me. Like there's light that has to get from the thermos to my eyes. If my eyes were closed or if I was in a completely darkened room, that would interrupt that. So there's literally things in between the thermos. In like a causal stream, there's the thermos itself and light bouncing off of it, and it's only somehow causally and temporally later that I have the perception that there's a thermos. And there's other sorts of things in between the thermos and that perception. Some of them are the light waves. Some of them are maybe activity happening in my eye. Probably an eye by itself doesn't see. If we just had a severed eye in a petri dish, it wouldn't count as a seer. Presumably the seeing is like downstream. It happens later. And here's another thing that we relate directness and indirectness to. It would be things that I know based on seeing, and things outside of my body that I know via some extra steps. So I can see that the thermos is green, or I can see that it has stickers on it. But can I see that the thermos is hot? You might say, like, if I see steam rising out of the thermos, that doesn't count. Like, you could feel that the thermos is hot, but if you see steam, there's got to be some kind of extra steps. You like say, well, what do I know about steam? What would make steam come out of the thermos? Oh, I know, if it was hot, steam would come out of the thermos. Although maybe if it had dry ice in it, it could be very cold and like visible vapor would be coming out of it. But I know this other stuff like this, it's unlikely that there's dry ice in my house, much more likely that there's very hot coffee in the house and in my thermos. So I make a guess. I make an educated guess. I go through a chain of inferences. And very tempting. One might even say natural to say that there's a distinction between directness and indirectness there. But again, it's relative, right? It is relatively more direct how I see my mug versus I'm sorry, it's relatively more direct how I can see the color of the mug than how I can see the temperature of the mug. I see the temperature of the mug only by courtesy of like some inference. Where with the color of the mug, I just see that, right? Until you ask scientists how that all works, and many of them are going to tell you that maybe there's some unconscious process of inference that the eye by itself doesn't detect green or thermosness. All that stuff that you thought you saw directly, like that it's green or that it has stickers on it, it turns out to be as inference involving as the stuff about seeing the temperature. On their story, the inferences are not conscious inferences. You might not even have conscious access to the inferences that are happening all the time when you perceive stuff. So anyway, there's a couple issues I just want to summarize really quick. One is when we're talking about directness, are we talking about absolute directness or relative directness? A lot of the privacy loving, qualia loving, anti-physicalist people out there talk about directness as if it's like some absolute thing. And I don't think I'm being uncharitable to them. I know that I could get them to say, yes, right. When we say direct, we mean as direct as conceivably possible. Just there it is, baby. It's just right there. There's literally nothing in between my knowledge of the qualia and my having of the qualia. But like seeing the external world or seeing some thermos on a TV screen and drawing the conclusion that it's in a state far away, that's not direct. I think a case can be made that it's all indirect and to some degree or other. There's just relative directness, but nothing like the very idea of absolute directness makes zero sense. It makes as much sense as absolute tallness. But also all of this is actually very theoretical. People understand the example about the steam, right? But if you really get into like absolute directness, you've gone into the philosophy room. Like that's some heavy duty philosophy theory. And since it's heavy duty philosophy theory, it's something we could surgically remove, Lance.
I think we could.
Surgically remove. No one needs to talk like that. I'm ready to continue the video.
All right. I have to take it back. I accidentally clicked somewhere, and I think we're about 20 seconds behind.
Go ahead, Hasselmerk explains further.
We'll start back.
To say that one's conscious states are private does not mean that nobody else can know anything about them. It rather means that nobody else can know about them in the same direct way. That is, my own conscious states appear directly to me, whereas the conscious states of other people we infer or perceive indirectly through their behavior, verbal reports, facial expressions, and so on. Because of this direct access, many philosophers also hold that our own consciousness can be known with absolute certainty. Descartes famously claimed that we have indubitable knowledge of our own consciousness, and thereby our own existence. Cogito ergo sum. End quote. So in crudely plain language, I cannot look at your experiences, not in the way that I can observe your body language, the contortions of your face, and even your neurological events. I'm not sure why anyone would deny that or claim to not understand what it.
So what he just said is dualism. So he just said, I cannot look at anyone else's experiences. But if you were at least one kind of physicalist, like, for example, a type identity physicalist, or even a token identity physicalist, any one of your experiences is literally identical to some neural state, some neural firing pattern in a network. And so you might not know that that's what you're looking at, but that's what you're literally looking at. So, for example, if Mark Twain was Samuel Clemens, which, by the way, Mark Twain is a pseudonym for Samuel Clemens, but you might not know that. You might be introduced to Samuel Clemens at a party. You've heard of Mark Twain before, but you didn't know that this guy that you've just been introduced to at the party is Mark Twain. So even though you don't realize that you're looking at Mark Twain while you're being introduced to Samuel Clemens, you are literally looking at Mark Twain when you look at Samuel Clemens. So when Emerson says this stuff to try to tell us what privacy is, he's doing it by making these assertions that if true would entail the falsity of at least identity physicalisms like type identity physicalism and token identity physicalism. There's just no way to say what he's saying without thereby committing to this anti-physicalism. Now, if he wanted to be a little bit more careful, he might say that the datum, the privacy datum, or the appearance of privacy, is that it seems like I can be aware of my own experiences without being aware of neural states. That's a fairly safe thing to say. That it can seem that way. It can seem like I'm looking at Samuel Clemens without it seeming to me that I'm looking at Mark Twain. But if you remove the seem, you can't look at Samuel Clemens without thereby looking at Mark Twain. And to say that you could look at Samuel Clemens while not looking at Mark Twain would seem to commit you to a dualism of those guys. You would be committed to there being two distinct people named respectively Mark Twain and Samuel Clemens. So I just want to flag that right there. Like he just did a dualism.
He might not like that.
Just did dualism, Emerson. Dualist.
All right. Should we continue?
Let's continue.
All right.
What is meant by that? For many people, this is an unrevisable datum that simply needs to be accounted for. Because they're my experiences, I'm in a different position with respect to them than you are or ever could be. I can't pull out a qualia microscope and zoom into your brain tissue and eventually see your thoughts and feelings and experiences. I can observe electrochemical brain activity. In principle, I could observe neurons and even the atoms that compose them and all the physical goings-on in your brain. And with enough progress in neuroscience, I could work out, in a sort of inferential way, what you're feeling. But this hypothetical futuristic technology will never put me in the same direct, immediate relation to your first-person experiences that you stand in. I like how Richard Swinburne put it, quote, "Whatever ways others have of finding out whether I am seeing the tree outside my window, or have a thought that today is Thursday, or am intending to shut the door, I could also use. Like others, I could study my behavior by watching a film of it, or inspect my brain via some instrument. But I have an additional way of finding out whether I am seeing the tree or having the thought that today is Thursday or am intending to shut the door, by actually having the experience of seeing the tree or having the thought or intention. And no one else could have that way of knowing about these events. A mental event would not be my mental event unless I could become aware of it by experiencing it. Someone else can have a pain of the same intensity and duration at the same time I do, but there would be two different pains, her pain and my pain. By contrast, what makes it the case that inanimate objects as well as humans and higher animals have physical events is that they are public events. What makes an event a physical event is that it is an event to which no one substance can have privileged access by experiencing it. Any physical event is necessarily equally accessible to any human with the right training. It is for this reason that all the events which happen in the inanimate world, and also all the events in our bodies, are physical events. A brain event, a certain neuron firing at a certain time, is a physical event. Although it may cause someone to have a sensation, the brain event is not itself an event to which anyone has the unique access of the kind that they have to their sensations.
Can you pause it? I'm sorry. So the only way a physicalist could agree with that is if the physicalist allowed that there was just some kind of sui generis asymmetry that was physical. So if they said, like, among the physical facts are that there's just this fundamental asymmetry, it's a physical law, they could do that. So, and if they could do that, then technically Emerson isn't, by asserting privacy, begging the question against physicalists. But I think most physicalists will not be happy about there being sui generis physical relations that involve minds and or knowledge or epistemic relations. And the reason I say that is that one thing the physicalists tend to agree on, even though they can't agree on a full definition of what it means to be physical, one thing they do tend to agree on are some necessary conditions on being physical, especially with respect to the mental. And one thing that the physicalists seem to agree on is that nothing mental can be fundamental. The only fundamental things would have to be themselves non-mental. And if there were any mental things, those mental things would have to be non-fundamental. Those mental things would resolve into like complexes of non-mental things. So to illustrate by analogy, most people that are physicalists don't think water is fundamental. Water is something that is complex, and it resolves into things that are more fundamental than water, and they are individually not water. So water is a complex of a certain amount of hydrogen and a certain amount of oxygen. Hydrogen and oxygen are more fundamental than water in the very literal sense of, like, there was some before water. There's a whole lot of hydrogen before there was even any oxygen. Water is, in a fairly literal sense, made out of hydrogen and oxygen. So nothing is fundamentally water. It is a complex that resolves into these relative simples that are individually not water. So, and that's the basic picture of the mind and mental stuff that physicalists would I think, say, like, yeah, that's what physicalism's all about. And so it wouldn't then be some just like fundamental law that minds have a special sui generis relation to their own states. That wouldn't be one of the physical laws, because it's making something mental fundamental. Anything that's going on with the mind, if there are any minds, according to the physicalists, the minds would have to be complexes that could be understood as resolvable into things that aren't mental. So no sui generis relations or laws or anything that involves the mental, if you're a physicalist. All right, please continue. Epistemic asymmetry argument. Let's do it. The music's cool.
So, summing up the epistemic asymmetry argument, I submit that it is easier to doubt the consciousness of others than it is to doubt the existence of my own consciousness. Radical stuff, I know. Further, a subject is rational in holding that the existence of their mind is more secure than the existence of other minds, because the subject has an additional source of justification for belief in the existence of their own mind. Whatever I have to support the existence of other minds, I also have for my mind, since I can observe all my physical behavior, for example, in a mirror or on a screen or with some scientific instrument. But it appears that I have something else to justify the belief in my mind that I do not have to justify my belief in other minds. So I think there's an epistemic asymmetry between one's own mind and the minds of others. That's how we get a problem of other minds to begin with. Here, it's not necessary to take a hard position on what that something else is exactly, just that A, it provides a source of justification for the belief in my own mind, a source of justification that I lack when it comes to the minds of others, and B, that it's private. So why believe that the extra source of justification is private rather than publicly accessible? Because if it were not private, then you could cite it to support your belief in the minds of others. But this is precisely what we've denied by accepting the asymmetry. You have an additional source of justification for the belief in the existence of your own mind that you do not have for the belief in the existence of other minds. Where could that additional justification come from other than private consciousness? Because if it weren't private, then you would also have it for others, not just yourself, and you'd be kicked back to the position of epistemic symmetry. So this is why there's a conflict between epistemic asymmetry and the rejection of mental privacy. In his contribution to Illusionism as a Theory of Consciousness, edited by Keith Frankish, George Ray made the following comment.
Can you
Quote,
pause it?
I seriously find it pretty...
All right, before we get into the Ray stuff, so what I just want to flag the Virtus Normative issue again. So one of the things that Emerson is rehearsing here is his explanatory argument that there is this datum. The datum is articulated by Emerson with a little help from some philosophers, myself included, in terms of epistemic asymmetry that one has to one's own mental states. That's supposed to be the datum. And then he says, well, what would explain that? What would explain that? And then he offers what would explain that is that there is something that is private. That's what explains this epistemic asymmetry. And some of the ways that he's saying it later in the video makes it sound like, well, he's justifying the existence of qualia. The qualia are private. Qualia are the source of the privacy. And so that explains this epistemic asymmetry. Just on the face of it, if you're going over it really quick, it sounds like an explanation that is non-circular. But if you pause and think about it, it might turn out to be a Virtus Normative explanation. If the datum is this epistemic asymmetry, well, what explains that? What explains that is that there's something that's private. Yeah, but what does privacy mean? Doesn't it just mean that there's an epistemic asymmetry? So you're explaining the epistemic asymmetry by saying there's an epistemic asymmetry, not an explanation. That is just like saying the sky is blue because the sky is blue, or opium makes you sleepy because it has the sleepy making power. Yeah, but what's that power? Like, in some sense, we know it has that power. We already said it makes people sleepy. That's the datum. We want an explanation. We want you to tell us something we didn't already know, on par with the tire is low on air, that would explain the datum, not just label the datum with a new name. It's seeming a little circular to me. I don't know how he's going to get out of this one. But okay, let's let him pick on Georges Ray a little bit, and then I'll defend Georges.
Okay.
pretty much as difficult to doubt the consciousness of other people and many higher animals as I do my own. So I found that pretty striking, since it's contrary to my views and probably most people's views. No one feels compelled to write, "Yeah, I find it much easier to doubt the existence of my dog's mind than my own mind." That's all I wanted to say. It's just too obvious to be worth writing for its own sake. Apparently, Ray feels differently. To him, they are equally difficult to doubt. So is this just an abnormal psychological fact about one person? Maybe, but I find it more likely that anyone who says this is in the grips of a theory that leads them to say it. For me, it's easier to...
I gotta pause. I have a... You might already know what I'm going to say, this because, you know, I've had people tell me for my like anti-realist views and some of my views on consciousness too, that I think this way because I am in the grip of a theory. And there's, you know, we've said a lot of praiseworthy things about Emerson here, but here I'll say something a little bit critical, which is that I take that to be a somewhat like a rhetorical swipe at a person to say that they're in the, because we could say Emerson is in the grip of a theory. The sound, it makes it sound like a person doesn't really internalize or grok or fully genuinely have the view in question, but rather it's like, well, this is the theory I've committed to, and I really believe in the theory. And so this is kind of at odds with what my disposition, my intuition, my inclinations would otherwise be. But because of my commitment, I'm going to endorse it. And so the person, there's an implication to say that they're in the grip of a theory, that they're you know uh, like delusional or possibly disingenuous, that or there's some sort of gap between a genuine, sincere, and full throated commitment to the view and the view that they actually have. And there seems to be an implication that there's something epistemically unvirtuous about them having this view, because really, even though they have all these good reasons not to have the view, the only reason, or the primary reason that they have it, is because of this prior commitment. And if they were to recognize that they're just holding the view because of that commitment, they would realize, maybe they should abandon the commitment, and then, the view that would prompt them to cause it. There seems to be an implication of that there. And like I feel like this is a, treating, you could treat every view as a nail and wield this like a hammer, because that could be said of anybody about anything that's doing any philosophy. Oh, the only reason you say this is because you're in the grip of a theory. And so I don't like that particular move. I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, I like accusing people of being in the grip of a theory, because sometimes people are presenting themselves as not being in the grip of a theory, which, is supposed to be some virtue that they have, that they're pure. They're just like reporting on what's obvious. And so I like to accuse them of being in the grip of a theory, as a swipe. So I'm not going to begrudge my opponents for swiping back. But a more serious point that I'd like to make at this juncture, perhaps it's a juxtaposition, Lance. But the point is that one of the things that's at stake in these conversations about like directness and privacy, one of the things that's at stake is a view in the philosophy of science about whether there is ever such a thing as not being in the grip of a theory. So people in the philosophy of science have gotten pretty comfortable, since the kind of general uptake of Kuhn. Although you could see this in earlier thinkers, Popper, even earlier. They've gotten pretty comfortable with this idea that all observation is theory laden. Another way to put the point is that there's no such thing as a neutral arbiter between theories. One way to put that is whether something counts as data or not is itself relative to a theory. So it's never the case that there's just some pure atheoretic neutral way of describing some supposed datum from which we could now like try to make decisions about which of two competing theories or competing explanations of that datum are the correct one. Whether something is a datum or not is going to be something that relative to one theory turns out, yes, it is a datum, and relative to another theory, it's not a datum. And a lot of the discussion of Kuhn in philosophy of science has been people wringing their hands about like, well, how can science be objective or make progress if there are no neutral arbiters? If it's all just theory, it's all just like different people saying, well, that's my opinion, man. It's like, are we doomed to not know anything? And lots of people have tried to propose ways of not panicking about that proposal. And one reaction to it is just to deny it, to say that, the myth of the given is itself a myth, that actually there is a given. We still have people out there that are foundationalists, right? That believe that there is like just these direct experiences, or that we just have this special kind of epistemic relation to, and it's the new version of sense datum theory, and everything else is maybe can be subjected to doubt, but not my own experiences, man. We still have those people, but what they are, at least from the point of view of 20th century and 21st century philosophy of science, what they are holdouts of this kind of old view of science, whereby the way empirical knowledge works is that there's this neutral thing, experience or observation, and then theories are measured relative to this neutral thing. And the winner, the one that is the closest to real truth, is the one that, you know, best explains the data. And in a post-Kuhnian view, everything is being in the grip of a theory. And the best you could do is, like, you know, have interlocutors that you roughly agree on what the theory is, and then you try to come up with some kind of agreement of how you would then settle disputes. So you and I can agree about this, and this, and we agree, like, okay, whatever the outcome of this experiment is, you know, it's going to decide who wins this fight. But it's always true that one of us could just stick to our guns and say, you know what? Nah, I don't lose. I'm going to just adjust my theory a little bit so I can reinterpret that data that initially looked like it was falsifying my theory to actually be consistent with it overall. That basic idea that you could always do that sometimes gets called in the philosophy of science the Duhem-Quine thesis. That for any putative disconfirming observation of some theory, the theory can always be saved by just adding or revising auxiliary hypotheses. You can always change your theory to be consistent with the data. Another way of putting it is you can always reinterpret the data and whether it's data or not. So, you know, one way to put what's one of the main background issues between my team and Emerson Green's team is that I think we're always in the grip of a theory. And so it's not an insult to say I'm in the grip of a theory. It's a little bit, I would say, a little bit dishonest or self-deceived to portray yourself as not in the grip of a theory. Everyone's in the grip of a theory. There's no such thing as not being in the grip of a theory. There's no such thing as pure awareness of the real data. That's just not going anywhere. So that's what I want to say about being in the grip. Everyone's in the grip. Everyone's got some theory or other. Even the qualiophiles. And their theory about themselves is that they're not in the grip of a theory. That's their theory. Nice theory. Yeah, I don't agree with it.
If it's true of all of us, then, you know, I don't really think that it doesn't asymmetrically apply as a distinctive criticism.
Right. It doesn't cut any ice. It has no dialectical force to say I'm in the grip of a theory. Although there are like micro situations in which, you know, there might be someone where it makes sense to say, like, look, you just are really stuck on this particular theory, and you're interpreting things in a way that just comes from that prior commitment, dude. The rest of us don't agree with you. But, so I can think of occasions.
This can happen.
Yeah,
I agree that this can happen, but I want people to be cautious about, you know, psychological speculation about the motivations or mindset of people that hold a particular view. Like, oh, Emerson could be right, but about the particular person. But one is, even if that's true of that particular person, that may or may not be a threat to the position that the person is arguing for. Like, okay, so maybe the person thinks something for questionable reasons. Okay, well, we can still independently evaluate the merits of the view. And two, we're rarely in a good position to make that sort of judgment. Making that judgment merely from a person's remarks from a published paper, I think will rarely be sufficient. You may make these judgments about a person that if you've spoken to them for a while or you know them well and you've had multiple conversations and you're like, all right, look, you are super stubborn about this view. I've given you like 5 or 6 objections, and like you'll pause and you'll squirm and then you'll just reassert your position. It looks to me like you're caught in the grip of the theory. But if I just see a person say something, the sort of thing that is just characteristic of a contrary position. It'd be a little strange for me to say, like, if I just read a random thing from a person that believes in phenomenal consciousness, and I'm like, look, this person's asserting that we have phenomenal consciousness. They're just caught in the grip of a theory. That I think, as you said, it doesn't cut any ice. That doesn't achieve anything, because I don't have any distinctive reasons to think that there's something questionable or objectionable about the reasoning processes that they use to arrive to that position that wouldn't be equally true of my own position.
One other thing I want to add is that one thing that I like when I have debates or dust ups with anti-physicalists of this stripe. I'm not saying Emerson does this, but I've run into people that agree with Emerson a lot of these topics, and they seem to have this view of the mind, whereby everything that happens in the mind is something that they themselves would be aware of, and so there is no behind the scenes with respect to the mind. Maybe there's a behind the scenes with the brain, but the brain is not the mind. The brain doesn't do any inferences. The brain doesn't do anything worth calling mental. There's no beliefs. There's no judgments. Everything that is mental is also in consciousness. And this is commonly a view that gets attributed to Descartes, although you could find earlier versions of this. But really famously in modern philosophy, there's this big debate or opposition between Descartes and Leibniz. So Leibniz was one of the really big names to oppose this view that everything that happens in the mind also happens in the arena of consciousness. And Leibniz puts forward this view whereby, to use Leibniz lingo, you could distinguish between perception and apperception. So, sticking more with Leibniz's lingo, a really simple monad might perceive greenness, but not apperceive that it perceives the greenness. It doesn't have, as we might say now, it doesn't have this higher order mental state. It just has the first order state, the perception of greenness. The perception of greenness happening consciously, happening in such a way that you are aware of it, that's something else. And only greater monads have that. They have that apperception in addition to the perception. And Leibniz accuses Descartes of just kind of like thinking that there's always apperception, that there's really no distinction between something happening in the mind and something being apperceived. Whether Descartes is actually guilty of that, I leave to people that care more about history than I do. But it's a common enough thing to attribute to Descartes and Leibniz that it's worth calling the Descartes-Leibniz debate. And we see it a lot in dust-ups between illusionists and their opponents. So, one way of spelling out illusionism, and by the way, ladies and gentlemen of the world, I'm not an illusionist. I'm just friends with a lot of illusionists. But a lot of conversations with opponents to illusionism will revolve around this very simple argument that gets made against illusionists, which says, like, illusions themselves presuppose phenomenal consciousness. You can't be under the illusion of anything without being conscious. And so therefore, take that, illusionists. And, sometimes that just seems like, okay, the person making that argument really doesn't know anything about anything. But there's sophisticated versions of that whereby they hold that there is just nothing besides what's in consciousness. So if there's an illusion, it's a conscious illusion. But a lot of people in philosophy of mind and in cognitive science and in neuroscience are very comfortable with this idea that there's lots of things that happen in the mind without it being in consciousness or in your awareness. So there might be all sorts of inferences happening, and therefore my for example, seeing that something's green is completely indirect. It just seems direct to me because I'm not conscious of all the indirectness. It's a mere apparent directness. And with a similar kind of apparatus where you can distinguish the unconscious mental states from the conscious mental states, you could articulate how there could be illusions without consciousness. Illusions are just false mental representations, which could occur unconsciously. And if you have a false mental representation that there is phenomenal consciousness or even consciousness at all, there you go. Whatever problems it has, it's not an outright contradiction. It's a perfectly coherent view, but it depends on drawing a distinction between what happens in the mind and what happens in consciousness. And I think not. I think too few people that come to these debates appreciate that. That's another one of the things that are at stake. I think a lot of times people come to this stuff and they think like, oh, there's just this very simple issue: is there privacy or not? Are there qualia or not? And they don't appreciate that right in the background are like 5 or 6 other philosophical debates, like stuff in the philosophy of science about whether there's such a thing as a neutral arbiter, things in philosophy of language about whether there's ever direct reference or whether all references via description, and other things also. I like to say it like you can't do a little bit of philosophy.
That's a really good way to put it.
You're always doing all of philosophy at once.
Yeah, this this is something I really emphasize a lot. Is this holistic aspect of philosophy where everything is really interconnected. And for me, I think that creates rather titanic dialectical hurdles whenever I want to have a conversation with somebody that has, I sometimes use an analogy of like a tree, and like I have very different metaphilosophical roots, and that results in very different leaves growing at the ends of the branches. There's a different kind of trunk. Everything is totally different.
Yeah.
But yet a lot of um, philosophical arguments, like the juicy stuff, the fun stuff, occurs at the extremity, at the branches, at the leaves. People want to argue, do we have free will or not? People want to argue, are there moral facts or not? People want to argue, are we conscious or not? And to even get clarity on what it is people are disputing, you bring in all these issues in philosophy of science, in philosophy of language, and really basic things like their everyday experiences, basic claims about what non-philosophers mean when they use words, where there'd be some sort of empirical considerations. And so there is so much of the arguments at the extremities, the grist for that mill are more fundamental philosophical positions that people take, and disputes about basic, you might say non-philosophical. You could just say stuff like basic empirical facts, like what do people mean when they use this word in most circumstances. So all of that is looming in the background in every single debate. And often that's the kind of stuff that if you wanted to get into those things, it would seem pedantic, it would seem like a digression, or it would be boring, or people would think that you want to go to that higher order dispute to dodge or to like evade being pressed at the and like you may not do that. You might just say, look, there's not really a way for you. I'll give an example. So I'm a pragmatist, so that makes me a pragmatist about truth, and that can make discussions with people that are not pragmatists about truth really difficult, because some of the basic terms that we're using actually mean something different than they do. And so how do we have that conversation if we can't take a step back and have a conversation about that? And if someone just wants to argue with me, like, let's say it's like an applied ethical issue, or it's an issue in consciousness about this, do we need to anesthetize babies before performing surgeries? Those applied concrete issues, there's like a million layers you got to go back. And I think that people want to address that issue directly.
Yeah.
Often, they don't want to go to all that other stuff. You want to open up the entire Pandora's box of all of philosophy to address this simple question here. And I think the answer in every case is yes, I do. And that makes every discussion really difficult.
So you made an analogy about a tree. I'm going to make an analogy, but mine's even weirder than trees. Do you know what isolations are in breakdancing?
No, I don't.
So you've probably seen breakdancers who could do this thing where it looks like their whole body is frozen, but they just move one body part. Like they move just their shoulder, or they are able to keep their, like they're able to keep their hands and their head and everything completely stationary with respect to the the surface of the earth, but just move their chest in a way that makes it look like their heart is really beating. So that that kind of dance move is known as isolation. And if you watch Dancing with the Stars as often as I do, you would know that when the contestant is a breakdancer, often they're getting complimented by the judges on how good they are at their isolations. So can you at least imagine what I'm talking about now? You've seen like a lot of breakdancing.
I know what that is. Once you described it, I know what it is.
Yeah, like interesting. You know what it would be like to see it based on my description. So anyway, a lot of times when you're breakdancing to look like a robot, you're doing a whole lot of isolations. That's kind of the secret of being able to be a convincing robot. And part of the reason why is a robot is it's very easy for a robot to do isolations, in part because a robot is not made out of squishy stuff like tendons and muscles. It's made out of these rigid metallic limb segments that are joined together with these really high tolerance joints. And there's individual motors for each joint. And so you can literally have just the wrist rotate or just the elbow flex, and the rest of the robot is completely rigid. Okay, now a very skilled breakdancer can learn how to do isolations. They can learn how to move just one body part while keeping the rest of the body still. And that's really hard. It's hard not just on a physical level, it's hard on just kind of like a mental level. You have to like learn all the different body parts and learn like how to notice these different feelings, like, oh, right, that I've got to clench this muscle and that muscle and that muscle and this if I want to do just like, you know, my arm broke and now it's hanging, and the rest of I just did a breakdancing move on live. I just did the broken arm thing. So the point of this analogy is that some philosophers have been trained to be able to do isolations with respect to their views, with respect to their judgments and their beliefs. Like a really highly trained philosophical arguer, like for example, David Chalmers is excellent at this. David Chalmers can have an argument with you about anything. He's one of these philosophers that he just loves all of philosophy, and I don't think he publishes in ethics, but I guarantee you could have like a really cool argument at the bar with Dave Chalmers about ethics or whatever. And part of his ability is his ability to just appreciate like, oh, we are just talking about this one thing. We're going to have a conversation about act utilitarianism versus rule utilitarianism. And so he will lock all of his other judgments or beliefs in place and just focus on this one particular thing. And in a lot of contexts, that's a great skill to have. That's a great thing to be able to do. And quite frankly, I'm excellent at it. I could do this kind of mental isolation thing. I can, even though I could get into it with you about like the nature of space time, or are colors objective or not, or rule utilitarianism versus act utilitarianism. I could say like, okay, right now we're just going to talk about moral realism versus moral anti-realism, and we can stay on topic and not cascade into like what is blue, right? But one of my frustrations I have when I talk to other people is I will just, you know, whip out what I think is an innocent example. Nothing rides on it. We're just talking about whether quality exists or not. The apple is red. But my interlocutor they want to also talk about the metaphysics of color. They don't even appreciate that that's part of what they're doing, that they have taken on board very specific views in some other philosophical area without recognizing that's what they're doing. They want to get into it with me, like about whether ever anything is actually red. And I'm like, I'm just trying to talk about the mind. I don't like, why you're talking about apples, please, one thing at a time. So now resembling a robot is not always a good thing. Like, you know, and I think this echoes an earlier point that you were making about, you know, respecting the way in which like just nice, regular, normal people, the way they talk. And the way they talk isn't about like carving things into tiny, neat boxes, and each box is separate from each other box. And we could zero in on the proposition, and they're using the term in this sense versus this other sense. For many, many people, it's just a big mush. They don't draw the distinctions that analytic philosophers might want to draw. And similarly, like when people think about things or have conversations about things, they're not able to make their mind work like a robot. It's just like they can't dance like a highly trained breakdancer and do these bodily isolations. They can't just like isolate, in part because they don't even know about all the different parts that one might isolate. They're not aware that, you know, of all these different muscles and ligaments and connections. So I would like to say that, you know, I would hope people would become more aware of isolations and the fact that it happens sometimes, that and sometimes it's artificial in a bad way, that like you just get hyper focused on this one little topic and pretending like there's no other issues that it's related to. And then you paint yourself into some crazy corner. You know, keep alive to the issue that actually you're assuming a whole bunch of things that are themselves, they're contentious, and, you know, might actually tank your whole theory. But also sometimes it's a skill that's worth having. It's worth being able to say like, look, we're just going to focus on this one thing and try to like say something non-stupid about it.
I really like that analogy to isolation. It also inspired me to do the thumbnail for this video. It's probably going to be a breakdancing robot. So
awesome! It's a robot doing the robot.
Yeah,
which
yeah,
is
exactly.
Cheating. That's cheating.
Well, then it's a cheating robot. That's what people are going to get. I wanted to ask. So I have other obligations. Do you mind doing a part 2 with me on this?
I don't mind doing a part 2. I also have other
halfway into
obligations.
the video. Yeah. So, I mean, this has been great. I love when I could get a lot out of a discussion where the video is the springboard, and it's not just the video. You know, we gotta add our own content here, and I think you did a lot of that. So, I'm really grateful for you being here, and especially I think that's such a strong ending. I'm like, oh, this is a good place to wrap it up. So let's do part 2.
Yeah, let's do a part 2. I think that, you know, we gave the audience a lot to think about. We gave Emerson Green a lot to think about. I'm sure he'll come back at us. And I'd love to do a part 2, but I'd also love to stop now because I'm completely dehydrated.
Yeah, I'm running low, and
I ran out a while ago.
All right, so let's call it there at about halfway, and we'll pick up at this point in the video the next time we do this. I don't know when that'll be. We got the holidays coming up. I don't think I'll be doing a lot of videos over the next week. So maybe it'll be in the new year. Yeah,
next year I'll teach everybody how to doubt that they are conscious.
All right, let's do it. All right, everybody. So yeah, no real engagement with the chat or anything today. I'm just gonna say all the standard stuff. So thanks, Pete Mandik, for joining me for today. Everybody, please leave comments on the video if you got questions and stuff. I like to engage the audience. Like the video, subscribe, do all the regular stuff, share it around, and maybe we'll get a response from Emerson. I don't know, but that'll do it for today, everybody. And if I don't see you again before the new year, then Happy New Year, Happy Holidays, all of that stuff. Take care, everybody.
Peace.